Temple University professor Bryant Simon talks about Bill Clinton's 1992 presidential campaign with a focus on the racial issues of the time. He argues that the 1988 presidential election and the resounding defeat of Democratic nominee Michael Dukakis framed the way Clinton ran for office by positioning himself as a moderate rather than a liberal. His class is an hour and 10 minutes.
All right, as you were walking in today, a couple things that we'll come back to as we sort of proceed in the lecture. We listened to NWA, Straight Outta Compton. We listened to The Chronic. And lastly, to Sister Souljah. And part of what we're thinking about today is it's clearly not Sister Souljah's prowess and talent as a rapper that gains her fame. It is that she's involved in a really kind of crucial moment in the 1992 presidential election. The election that brings Bill Clinton to the White House. And so what we want to talk about today, and what we're going to talk about today, is the 1992 election as a kind of pivotal moment in post-war American politics. So that's our incident, right? We've been going through incidents every day. We're going to return to the political today. And we're going to look at the meaning of this election, and then we'll kind of answer the question about Sister Souljah's role in it. So that's the kind of trajectory. Now, let's start with kind of an argument, right? One of the arguments that journalists and political commentators make about the 1992 election is that the Sister Souljah moment is crucial to Clinton's victory. So one of the things we want to do is sort of take that argument on and see if it makes sense to us. And the argument I want to make for you today is that 1992 is a crucial election in American history. Now, on the surface of this might seem obvious, right? Clinton won 2 terms in office, 1992 and 1996. Who was the Democratic president before him to win 2 terms in office?
LBJ?
No, not LBJ. Backwards. FDR. We have to go back to the 1940s to find a Democrat who had won 2 terms in a row. 1992. When was the last time before 1992 that a Democrat had won office? Carter in 76, right? So on the surface of this, it would seem significant just because it's about Democrats returning to power in the White House, right? That's not the argument I'm going to make to you. The argument I'm going to make is that the significance of Clinton's victory is the consolidation of the politics of Ronald Reagan. In a sense, Clinton's victory is the ultimate victory of the Republican agenda. So it's that counterintuitive argument that I want to make for you today. So why? Why? In part, I want to argue that Clinton is continuity to a certain extent with the Reagan-Bush agenda. Continuity in the sense of questioning the role of government in public life, in maintaining the Social Security state, of upholding welfare, all those things that Reagan had attacked, right? Clinton goes along with. That's my first point on this. Second, we talked about this before. Reagan begins to elevate the middle class to the center of American politics, right? Kind of following off on that Nixon trend of the silent majority. Clinton does the same thing. This is a campaign about building the strength of the middle class. The poor are absent. And if you're thinking there's some amazing thing that happens in the middle right before the election, it's the LA riots. And they are almost non-existent. Right? We always want to think about gaps in silence. Third, Clinton is a triumph of the idea of being tough on crime. And we're going to talk about this all week, right? But we're going to see about crime and social issues and how they begin to be part of the political discourse across party lines. Remember, we are more interested in political movements and ideas that cross party lines, that there's a consensus on, than ideas that one party has. That suggests power of an idea, right? And lastly, Clinton's election, the Sister Soldier movement, is about a continuing ambivalence about race in American life. A continuing anxiety on the part of some of the public role of African Americans. A continuing fear that perhaps African Americans have too much power in American life. And a continuing wooing of white Democrats, Reagan Democrats in the North, and white Southerners in the South using kind of coded and veiled messages about race. Again, something that we saw with, right, the opening of Ronald Reagan's 1980 campaign. So those are the kinds of ideas we want to kind of think about today. So let's think about where to start. Let's think about democratic dilemmas, right? It's 1992. We've already kind of hinted, right, at the frustrations of the Democratic Party in presidential elections. They had done poorly, right? So this always happens, right? Except for Chip Kelly, right? You have to make a kind of assessment of where you're at, what you're doing wrong, and how to improve on things. So in 1984, we talked about it. The Democrats get trounced, right? Who's the Democratic presidential candidate in 1984? Walter Mondale, who is a traditional liberal. He gets trounced, right? It makes sense that you rethink the appeal of that message. So that message is sort of up for grabs in 1984, right? Not sure if this is the message that the Democrats want to use. And they would take this lesson to heart. In 1988, Democrats would nominate Michael Dukakis as their presidential candidate. And Dukakis is the governor of Massachusetts. Despite what that Massachusetts tie means and what label means, Dukakis is a moderate. He's a middle-of-the-roader, a technocrat who kind of emphasizes competence over ideology. Right? And this is a response. The idea that we can, a moderate could possibly win this election. And so I want to just talk about, what's going on in this election, because it's a fascinating election, because the other thing that's going to take place in this election, so the Democrats sort of make this move, right, to a moderate. But we can also see in this election the beginning of a kind of new and really intense campaign advertising that begins to frame issues that's highly related to the CNN effect that we talked about. And not just the 24-hour news cycle, but the emotionalization of issues, right? You know how we talked about that, how CNN kind of emotionalizes an issue by bringing it right at you. So part of what's going to happen in the Dukakis election is fascinating for the way in which television and advertising kind of play a kind of key role in these issues. And again, what we're going to see is how Clinton in 92 is going to respond to this. So Dukakis gets the nomination. He's running against George Bush, the first. George, I get him confused, but the older George Bush, the one who's 91 now. So George Bush, and part of this again is the framing of the issue. Dukakis wins the nomination, and in a kind of interesting move, the Bush campaign goes on television early. And we know about this now, and they go on television early because they want to frame the debate. They want to label Dukakis in a certain way. And I already told you, Dukakis is essentially a moderate. He's not a kind of Mondale liberal. He's a moderate. He believes in economic growth. He believes in kind of technocratic solutions to things. And he offers this competency up as his campaign. But the Bush campaign goes at him right away and almost immediately frames him, and they use this word, Massachusetts liberal. And by that, they're trying to link him to Teddy Kennedy. Teddy Kennedy, the brother, right, of John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, who is the senator from Massachusetts, who historically is one of the most liberal members of the Senate, who also has a little bit of a problem with drinking and driving cars off of bridges, right? But the linking is deliberate here, because liberalism is being framed not just as policies, but as a kind of recklessness, a kind of identification, as we'll see with the 1960s. We've already seen hints of this, right? And so the Bush campaign gets out front and immediately frames, right, in the way television can, Dukakis as a liberal and hammers away at his liberalism. Now, this does a couple things for us. This hints at something that's going to develop, right? The triumph of ideas matters more than party. Liberalism is becoming almost a dirty word in American politics. George McGovern didn't run away from the label of liberal. Jimmy Carter didn't even really run away from the label of liberal. By the 80s, the sense of liberalism as something bad inherently is beginning to get couched that way. Clinton would never, as we'll see, call himself a liberal. It's part of the triumph of Bernie Sanders, right, that he's almost reintroducing liberal ideas to the debate. But Dukakis gets framed again as this Massachusetts liberal. Dukakis also, Reagan, this is one of the most famous kind of pictures from the campaign. Remember, Reagan had promised to make America great again, and one of the ways he'd promised to make America great again was to make the military strong again. Democrats respond. Dukakis responds by saying he strongly supports the military. And so in order to do this, right, he takes a ride in a tank, thinking he can win the optics kind of battle. And instead it makes him look like a fool. And this ad gets, again and again, this expression on his face gets framed in the ad talking about how he'll destroy the military. So we have issues here and framing. Things not going well for the Democrats early on. Now, the biggest issue in the campaign turns out to be issues about crime. Dukakis, like many liberals at the time and moderates at the time, was opposed to the death penalty. This politics of opposition to the death penalty had come out of the 1960s in many ways, and many states had sort of pulled back and repealed their death penalty laws. Massachusetts was one of them. George Bush campaigns hard. He campaigns hard on his support of the death penalty, trying to sort of couch Michael Dukakis as easy on crime. Dukakis is not going to be sort of strong on issues of lack of discipline, of people who don't work hard. All these issues are starting to get sort of kind of wrapped together. And the most famous campaign ad of this period is this ad about Willie Horton. And Bush has this advisor. His name is Lee Atwater. Lee Atwater is a South Carolina political operative who, interestingly enough, Atwater is a South Carolina political operative. He's a bulldog. And he comes up with this ad that I'll show you in a minute that talks about Dukakis' policies. Dukakis had this policy that criminals could have weekend furloughs. They could leave prison for the weekend to visit their families. And one of them, Willie Horton, an African-American man, would leave prison one weekend and murder and rape somebody. And what Atwater says is if we can make Willie Horton a household name, we'll win the election. But what it's also trying to do is tie Dukakis to issues of race. Tie Dukakis to somebody who possibly is going to allow African Americans to have too much power. It's to raise fears, one of the kind of most long-standing fears in American life, the fear of the black man. Right? This goes back and sort of is played off as kind of for a long time, right? And so just watch the ad for a second.
Bush and Dukakis on crime. Bush supports the death penalty for first-degree murderers. Dukakis not only opposes the death penalty, he allowed first-degree murderers to have weekend passes from prison. One was Willie Horton, who murdered a boy in a robbery, stabbing him 19 times. Despite a life sentence, Horton received 10 weekend passes from prison. Horton fled, kidnapped a young couple, stabbing the man and repeatedly raping his girlfriend. Weekend prison passes. Dukakis on crime.
Interestingly enough, Atwater would die a few years ago, and he would. Oh no.
Governor Michael Dukakis vetoed mandatory sentences for drug dealers. He vetoed the death penalty. His revolving door prison policy gave weekend furloughs to first-degree murderers.
The seamless integration of technology in the classroom. Interestingly enough, Atwater would die. He would get I think he had brain cancer, and on his deathbed, he would ask for forgiveness for the Willie Horton ad. Ask for forgiveness for the people who he thought that he wronged in the kind of end of his life. And there's actually a really interesting play about the end of his life that was produced as he kind of comes to terms with it. But again, think about what Bush is doing here. Nowhere in this debate, right, is the problem of unequal salaries in America, right? Nowhere in this debate is the problem of concentrated poverty in our cities. The debate comes down to whether you support the death penalty or not. What else is Bush doing in this ad? He is linking the Democratic Party to crime, to lax kind of morals in a sense, and also to African Americans, making Willie Horton, as Lee Atwater said, the face of the party. Remember what we're talking about today, the 1992 election. All of this is on Bill Clinton's mind as he runs for president, right? All of this is on Bill Clinton's mind. Not to get framed early, fears about kind of getting linked to crime and to race in certain ways. And Clinton has to think this through as he runs for president. And again, that's kind of the point that we're trying to get to. So the other kind of candidate, right, in 1988 is Jesse Jackson. Jesse Jackson makes this historic run for president, and as the campaign ends, Dukakis and Jackson come to a rapprochement. Jackson's given a very kind of prominent role in the convention. A number of Jackson's kind of platform planks are added to the national Democratic ticket platform, and there's a perception, in part driven by media, that Dukakis gives up too much to Jackson. Not just any candidate, a former civil rights leader, an African-American man, and a deeply polarizing figure in American life in the 1980s. Again, on Clinton's mind as he prepares to run for the presidency in 1992. So here's the election results. What's conspicuous here? What's conspicuous here about these election results? Again, if you analyze electoral data, Dukakis is in blue. Yeah, Jake.
Only northern states are taken by Democrats.
Yeah, right? We've been talking about this battle over the South for a long time. Clinton has to think of a way to pry off some of these southern states, right? We've seen how this shapes politics before. What else do we see going on here? Think about the way party politics works. Where else has Dukakis lost?
Rust Belt. The Rust Belt?
Yeah, right? He's lost Pennsylvania, Ohio, right? Into this area, right? Where he loses the votes of who? Reagan Democrats. Yeah, Ben.
California is a red state. It must be the last time that happened.
Good.
California voted Republican. It's a red state. That must be the last time that happened.
Yeah, so California is going to be this outlier. He's got to win. You can see he's starting to win the West Coast, which is crucial. You know, essentially the Democratic constituency now is both coasts. So California has to happen. So again, what's on Clinton's mind is this map, translating the deficiencies of Dukakis into strengths. And we're going to see how Clinton will sort of try and engineer this in 1992. All right, this is Clinton on the cover in 1992. And who is Bill Clinton? Is not an easy question to answer. Anyone know Clinton's hometown? Arkansas. But that's a state. He's from Arkansas.
Little Rock.
No, he's not from Little Rock. He's from Hope. I swear. He's from a town called Hope, Arkansas. Come on, this is good stuff, right? And Clinton's biography is fascinating. You know, Clinton's father dies when he's young. He's born in 1948 in this little town of Hope, Arkansas. His mom supports him. She remarries this guy, Roger Clinton, who is an alcoholic and an abuser. And Clinton grows up in this kind of dysfunctional, abusive household, and also in the town of Hot Springs, Arkansas, which is known as this kind of lawless town. It had a history of gambling, of illegal alcohol when there was illegal alcohol, and this was kind of Clinton's milieu. He confronts his father in his teens over abusing his mother, yet keeps his name. And Clinton has this kind of voracious, and I don't even know, it's the best word to describe it, just this unkind of containable ambition. And this is something you have to understand about Bill Clinton. It's a kind of ambition. I know many of you are ambitious. I'm not sure it has the same kind of dimensions and almost self-consuming quality. And one of his ambitions is to get the hell out of Hope and Hot Springs, Arkansas. And you have to, again, put this in perspective. Here's Clinton, right, from this kind of not very wealthy family, a family really challenged kind of in all kinds of ways, and he ends up at Georgetown. That alone, right, is a kind of accomplishment. And he ends up at Georgetown. Why? This is the other thing about Bill Clinton, because he wanted to be close to Washington. He's already politically ambitious. He would go from Georgetown to be a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, and then to Yale Law School, where he meets Hillary Rodham. And at 34, he's elected governor of Arkansas. And he would be elected 4 times. He's in his mid-40s when he runs for president. One other thing important here, right? Clinton's born in 48, which means what? He grows up during the 1960s. This is going to come back to play as part of the story, right? Ambition, and this ambition means lots of things are malleable for Clinton. That ambition is fundamental to understanding him. And here's a case, right? We want to think about scale of analysis always. Clinton is not simply a product of his times. His biography matters. Who he is matters. It interacts with time, right? So when we're analyzing things, we always want to kind of keep our scale in focus. What it is we're trying to make sense of. And Clinton, those things interact with each other, right? Who's Clinton with here?
McGovern.
This is Clinton with George McGovern. Clinton starts out in the 70s as a liberal. A traditional liberal in many ways. So one of the stories we're going to tell is the transformation of Clinton's politics. The hair's great, right? Yeah, there's some great, you'll see, there's some good Clinton pictures. By 1992, just to give us a sense of transformation, Clinton is a member of the Democratic Leadership Council, the DLC. This is an organization deliberately committed to moving the Democratic Party away from the left and liberalism to the center. Clinton himself has changed. He's no longer a liberal, he's a centrist. And he's part of this organization committed to centrist politics. Committed to centrist politics to get elected. So Clinton himself has made this transformation to the DLC. And again, so let's just try and figure out a little bit about who Clinton is in 1992. Clinton would make overtures to traditional democratic politics, but not all of them. He would be pro-choice, right, knowing how this is a divided issue in America, and Clinton would take advantage, in many ways for the first time, of winning the polarity of the women's vote. He would still be in favor of infrastructure projects, like some big building projects to boost the economy. Clinton is nominally, not even nominally, he supports civil rights. Supports affirmative action with limits. I mean, there's always the caveat with Bill Clinton. And he would famously, though we get burned on it, Bill and Hillary would support health care reform. But look at this poster. The emphasis is clearly on the middle class. Clinton would begin and solidify the tradition, which has become a Democratic tradition, of not talking about poverty, particularly. It was a campaign about the middle class. This is in part reaching to California, reaching to the suburbs in those Rust Belt states, and making some overtures to the ambitions of Reagan Republicans, who define themselves, right, as middle class. You can stay there. What else does Clinton support? And remember, from that Blumenthal essay, this is where the votes are, right? Turnout is going down during this period. And remember that Blumenthal essay, he says, part of the Republican success is they mine votes and the people most likely to vote. Clinton's going to go there as well, right? Knowing that that's the case. But in a kind of more dramatic way, Clinton is going to criticize the idea of tax and spend policies. And he'll use that phrase, which actually Republicans first used, to define liberalism. Clinton would promise, famously, to end welfare as we know it. We've already seen these attacks on welfare, right, as an illegitimate form of government spending. I don't want my hard-earned tax dollars going to them. No longer the sense of Social Security as a social good. Clinton would play into that, right? He would talk again and again about reducing government bureaucracy. Think about the Reagan line, right? Government is the threat. Clinton's in favor of reducing it. He would promise to pay down the deficit. We already saw the deficit looming as an important political issue in the 1980s, right? With tax cuts, increases in military spending, the way the deficit limits possibilities. Clinton, we've already seen this, is in favor of free trade policies. This has been a Republican staple of growing bigger markets for business. Clinton would support NAFTA. And here, interestingly enough, he goes right in the face of organized labor. Unions didn't want NAFTA. It would affect manufacturing. And so Clinton is gambling in a way that McGovern wouldn't gamble, that organized labor and those Reagan Democrats don't care about those issues in the same way anymore. This is a kind of interesting, but he's distancing himself from organized labor here. And he would also talk again and again about tax codes that were friendly for business. These were not issues Democrats had traditionally talked about, right? So Clinton is kind of positioning himself as a moderate. Remember, social issues matter. And Clinton would sort of play on social issues as well. He promised he would be tough on crime. He was not, and we'll see this again and again, he is not going to make the mistake that Dukakis made on crime. Clinton would talk again and again about individual responsibility. Crime was not a social issue. That means different solutions, right? Crime was not a social issue, it was a matter of individual responsibility. Clinton supports the death penalty, and we'll see, he goes on both sides of this, classically Clinton. He supports traditional marriage. He would also support sort of gays in the military, but then he had this crazy policy, don't ask, don't tell. It was, another day. So again, you can see, right? You can see pretty clearly what Clinton's trying to do here. You can see him distancing himself from the McGovern agenda. You can see him beginning to learn from the mistakes of Dukakis. Now, it's Bill Clinton, right? So the story's not going to be simple. Part of who Clinton was, part of his appeal, was that he was the first president to run who really was a child of the 1960s. And this is going to come with all kinds of baggage. But Clinton embodied in some ways, reproduced in a lot of ways, the kind of more informal style of the 1960s. One of the ways he hoped to get out of Arkansas was playing the saxophone. He was not very good, but he could play, right? And he famously, in the middle of the campaign, goes on the Arsenio Hall show, which was the kind of leading talk show for younger people, and plays the saxophone with sunglasses on. This is not something that, George Bush would have done, Ronald Reagan would have done, Richard Nixon couldn't have done, right? Kind of, this is who I am. I can sort of play this informal role, right? And so this becomes one of the kind of famous images from the campaign. I love this photo, right? This is Bill and Hillary. But remember, the 60s had been this dividing wedge in American politics since the 1960s. Right? And for Republicans, Reagan had run hard against the 1960s as an issue. Pat Buchanan had pushed these issues. That the 60s meant a kind of loosening of morals. The 60s represent a kind of sexual freedom, troubling to people we've seen, right? The 60s represent support for Roe in some ways. And several scholars in the 92 election, now we're going to see an interpretation I'm not totally going to buy, see the election of 1992 as a referendum on the 1960s. That Clinton embodies it, and those who vote in favor of it are in favor of some of the ideas of the 1960s. Those who reject Clinton reject those ideas. And I think there's an element of this to it, but it would play in the background throughout the election. And it would sort of come to the fore on two really kind of fascinating issues. Clinton was a product of the 1960s. This era after Reagan is an era of America being strong again, of patriotism. Clinton had used his connections to dodge the draft. There's no way around it. And so did Donald Trump, we will learn in clearer language. So did young George Bush. Upper middle class people with connections, did not generally serve during Vietnam. But we seem to not want to recognize that. And Clinton and conservatives begin to pillar him over his draft record. The other thing, Clinton is a product of the 1960s. He's asked at one point if he ever smoked pot. And Clinton gives one of the great Clinton answers. Yes, but he didn't inhale. And he made this, and it was a crazy, and as people come to learn Bill Clinton better, this tension sometimes with the truth, if you will, surfaces again and again. Because that ambition, right? He saw a small issue getting in the way of his ambition. And, he couldn't just cop to say, I smoked a few joints. Clinton says he tried it, and where does he say he tried it? Does anyone know?
I've always heard that he had asthma, so he couldn't smoke, but he always ate edibles.
No, that's not. Oh, that might be true. But what he says is, I tried it once in England when I was at Oxford, meaning that he was not subject to the laws of the United States. And then, in case you were worried about it, I didn't inhale. And what he says is, I tried to, but I just couldn't do it. But part of this is the politics of nothing that is floating around during this era with television ads and CNN drilling us every day and looking for news. But part of it is smoking pot and the draft are representations of the 1960s. Things that that Clinton will appeal to people in California and other kind of more liberal states, right? But will turn people off. Those Okies from Muskogee, right? That tradition in American political life. And so Clinton is like right up in that. So then there's Bill Clinton as well. Clinton was a serial philanderer. So, I mean, I think that's a fair thing to say. And so in the middle of, so it's about January of 1992. 1992, right before the Iowa caucuses and the New Hampshire primaries. And a story explodes during that year that Clinton had had an affair. People in Arkansas knew about this. I mean, it was kind of in the air. And this is Jennifer Flowers, who will go sell her story to the Star newspaper. But what's interesting here, so those kind of tabloids, right, that you get in the tabloids you see in the supermarket, what's interesting is her story gets picked up by CNN and other respectable news outlets. And she says she's had an 11-year affair with Clinton. And so now, like, these issues of marital fidelity are coming into the race, raising the kind of 60s question, right, that Clinton has kind of loose morals. And Clinton goes on in a kind of famous kind of moment. He goes on 60 minutes after the Super Bowl. So biggest audience possible, right? And he sits down. Hillary is sort of forced to sit down next to him. She has changed her name, by the way, from Hillary Rodham to Hillary Rodham Clinton, right around 1992, as the moderate Clintons kind of are previewed. And Clinton says, no, he didn't have an affair with Jennifer Flowers. Classic Clinton, but I've caused pain in my marriage. And, you know, he actually survives. He survives to live another day, but he's beginning to create a kind of polarization of kind of personalities. And eventually, Clinton will secure the nomination. But on the way to the nomination, I think this is a much more important moment. In a really troubling moment to me, but you have to think about this for yourselves. Clinton's campaigning, and he returns to Arkansas to sign the death warrant because he supports the death penalty on this guy, Ricky Ray Recker. Recker had killed a police officer, but not wanting to get caught, he'd also shot himself in the head and basically was lobotomized. He was basically totally debilitated. And Clinton went home very publicly to oversee the death penalty in the execution of Recker. To say, look, I am tough on crime. I suspect, right, we can think about or kind of just at least leave out there the fact of race as not said, right, but this was not going to be, he was not going to get Willie Hortoned. And Clinton will eventually sort of push Jennifer Flowers, and it happened right after the Jennifer Flowers kind of revelations were put out. And several people, biographers of Clinton, have been really hard on him on this. Christopher Hitchens, he devotes an entire chapter of his biography of Clinton to the Recker story. And essentially says, look, Clinton sort of was willing to sort of sacrifice this kid's life, not that there was a whole lot of quality of life left here, in order to make a campaign point. One sec. Yeah, he's going to ask a question.
So did they still put him to death?
Yes.
Even though he was mentally incapacitated?
Yes.
Okay.
And Clinton signs the order, right? And this sort of with campaign cameras follow him back for that moment. So again, you can see the politics of this, but this is getting we're getting into the kind of really the tough part of this set of politics. It secures Clinton the nomination. Now, in the summer of '92, Clinton was in third place. This is the last time, right? I mean, there's a very serious third-party challenge in the 1992 election. So you have George Bush, the incumbent president, running as a Republican. And for a third-party candidate, you have this guy, Ross Perot. Perot is a Texas billionaire. He'd made his money with kind of systems management and investments in Texas. And he self-finances his campaign. Sound familiar? He can't be bought. And Perot has two issues. Perot's pretty good on TV. And he uses CNN actually quite brilliantly. He appears again and again on the Larry King Show, which was a really kind of important nighttime show on CNN. And he's got two issues that he hammers away at. One is the deficit. He says, look, we are running up deficits and they are going to cripple our children. I don't want this to happen to my grandchildren. He has a very folksy voice. And he's good. Again, he's very good on television. And the second thing he's against are trade deals. He says NAFTA and these other trade deals produce a sucking sound that you can hear, and what's being sucked away are manufacturing jobs in the United States. And he's in favor of putting up a wall between the United States and Mexico, not to keep immigrants out, but to keep jobs in. No one talks about Canada, but he wants a wall there too. But right, that this idea, right, that we have to keep jobs internally. So he's simplifying, he's identifying two really key problems in American life, and his poll numbers are going up. And Bush and Perot, at one point Perot's in the lead, then Bush is in the lead. Clinton is never in the lead in the summer run up to the election. And Perot, the Perot campaign is crazy if you want to look at it. Perot at one point just stops campaigning. And then he appears again, and he has his vice presidential candidate who's like not quite there. Like, it's not the best run campaign, but for a while, right, it's really an important dynamic in this 1992 race, and it would be till the end. Clinton will win in a three-person race, and so Perot's presence is important. And later, it seems like he's taken more from Republicans. That Perot loved these charts, and he would constantly have these charts. Right, like Joe Miller, he could explain things so a 6-year-old can understand it. He was right that he was able to explain things really, really clearly. I like time covers. So, in the middle of all of this, Los Angeles explodes. Just as an aside, right? Because there's a couple of sides we need to kind of consider. LA explodes, and you got to think about this for a second. CNN effect. It's on television. This is the second biggest city in America. And it goes up in flames. Again, over an issue that deals with race, the police beating of Rodney King and the acquittal of the people who beat him. And this, to me, is the most amazing thing about the 1992 election. Billions of dollars in property loss, 56 people die. By September, it doesn't even register as a discussion on the campaign trail. Here's an example of what's not there is important, because that means confronting poverty. That means, right, South Central, which explodes, is a heavily African-American section of Los Angeles, and Latino to a certain extent, that's poor. The causes of that poverty are brushed aside. And one of the things that the riots blamed on is rap. And so one of the side stories that we'll get to, because this will get us to Sister Souljah, is by 1992, we have the emergence of gangster rap. And gangster rap at this point, right, it's important to recognize, right, in some ways this is a rejection of that kind of universalism that Michael Jackson was trying to achieve. It was a distinctly African-American genre at this point, representing the experiences of African-Americans and sonically meant to offend to a certain extent, right? Really loud, using offensive language often, talking almost an internal discussion, right? I mean, if you think about NWA and Public Enemy, in some ways the discussion is internal. It's for black people to black people in many ways. And like new musical genres, like rock and roll had, like jazz had, it's driving people crazy. In some ways, people recognize that it's the attack on the system. Other people don't like the new sound. And again, remember, this is not mainstream at this point. It's largely playing to African American audiences. But you have songs indicting the police. Can't say that word. We have songs, right, talking about the kind of unequal economic system in the cities. Songs, right, that people call these street ethnographies that are really detailing what's going on. And so rap, right, music can also create divides. Yes, Stephanie.
I find it interesting how in the 1960s you're seeing the riots in Detroit and Oakland happening at that same time, and now you're seeing the riots happen in LA over race. It's the kind of the same issue, but you have a president now who's lived through it and kind of understands it. Whether it's coincidental or not, I think it's a big reason why he ends up winning that election is because he understands how the civil rights movement worked back then and all of that.
I think it's an interesting argument, remember, but Clinton's not willing to talk about it. And that will take us, let me know if you still think that after we talk about the Sister Souljah moment, right? All right, so this idea, this kind of uneasiness with rap is in the air in the summer of 1992. And Clinton, remember, is behind in the polls. And this is Sister Souljah, who's this rapper in 1992. This is the words to the song That Hate produced. Sister Souljah is a black nationalist.
I know a lot of early rap played off of like the Nation of Islam also, right? Like Nation of Gods and Earths, and there was kind of an appropriation of that by like the urban community, I think that was more of not an attack on the system, but an attempt to create a sense of community in urban areas. Like I think that's being underplayed here. Like the
question is whether it's an either or, right? Because the kind of nationalism that Sister Souljah is embracing is a nationalism that says we are separate. If you think about a lot of NWA songs, they'll say, "Does this look like America to you?" This sense that we've created this kind of unequal space in America that's outside of it, and Clinton will clearly play that dimension of it, not the notion of community building, as we'll see, right? So, as always, there's possible interpretations out there. Who gets to frame it? It's important. So we'll see what Clinton does with this. So all this is stewing, right, in 1992. And according to the Washington Post, Clinton's in third place, right? He has to do something to shake up the election. Kind of racial tensions in the air, kind of, right? And so according to one of his, the Washington Post, Clinton's campaign staff in the summer of 1992 has intense debate about how it should distance itself from Jesse Jackson, distance itself from civil rights, distance itself from kind of policies associated with African Americans, which they think are unpopular with moderate voters. Code word for who? Middle class, white, South, maybe Reagan Democrats, right? Think about that map again, right? That's in Clinton's head, who he has to win. And so it's in this context, right? It's in this context, the summer of 1992, Clinton trailing, the LA riots have happened, rap is kind of bristling, the rise of kind of nationalist politics within the black community, that Clinton creates what will later be called the Sister Souljah moment. And all right, so let's listen. Let's just think about context here for a second. Where does this happen? Anyone pick up on this? Where is Clinton when he gives his speech? He's at the Rainbow Coalition annual meeting. The Rainbow Coalition is Jesse Jackson's political organization. We're going to bring a rainbow of people together. Jesse Jackson is sitting next to him when he makes this speech. A couple days before this, Sister Souljah, and Clinton will say it, had gone on in the newspaper, had made this comment essentially saying, look, we need to take some white lives for some black lives. And so Clinton, who's invited to this event, gives this speech. And so let's listen to the Clinton speech and think about what he's trying to do here.
Finally, let's stand up for what's always been best about the Rainbow Coalition, which is people coming together across racial lines. You talked about Mr. Fields from Louisiana that you had here last night, a great role model. We don't have a lot of time to do this. We don't have a lot of time. You had a rap singer here last night named Sister Soldier. I defend her right to express herself through music. But her comments before and after Los Angeles were filled with the kind of hatred that you do not honor today and tonight. Just listen to this, what she said. She told the Washington Post about a month ago, and I quote, "If black people kill black people every day, why not have a week and kill white people? So you're a gang member and you normally kill somebody? Why not kill a white person?" Last year she said, "You can't call me or any black person anywhere in the world a racist. We don't have the power to do to white people what white people have done to us. And even if we did, we don't have that low-down, dirty nature. If there are any good white people, I haven't met them. Where are they? Right here in this room. That's where they are." I know she is a young person, but she has a big influence on a lot of people. And when people say that, if you took the words white and black and you reversed them, you might think David Duke was giving that speech.
He's the head of the Klan at the time.
Let me tell you, we all make mistakes, and sometimes we're not as sensitive as we ought to be. And we have an obligation, all of us, to call attention to prejudice wherever we see it. A few months ago, I made a mistake. I joined a friend of mine and I played golf at a country club that didn't have any African American members. And I was criticized for doing it. You know what? I was rightly criticized for doing it. I made a mistake. And I said I would never do that again. And I think all of us have got to be sensitive to that. We can't get anywhere in this country pointing the finger at one another across racial lines. If we do that, we're dead, and they will beat us. Even in Reverend Jackson's new math of this election, it's hard to get to a 34% solution or a 40% solution if the American people can be divided by race. I have seen the hate.
Jesse's not too happy there. All right, so here's one assessment and what this Sister Soldier moment means. Right? The so-called Sister Soldier moment is a calculated denunciation of an extremist position or special interest group, wrap Clinton in a warm, centrist glow just in time for the election. Do you buy that? Is that what Clinton's doing here? What's he doing in this speech? Yes, Dan.
I just feel like he's trying to keep the country together as a whole. That's how it feels like to me, and I'm going to stand by my argument that I made before in the sense that the whole with those riots, the government at that time was still trying to keep the African American community and the white community together, not have a separate kind of African nation, and he's trying to keep everybody together again, almost like Lincoln at the same time. I know that that's a really big comparison.
I think Bill Clinton would like that.
But I mean, yeah. I'm sure anybody would kind of like that kind of comparison, but in a sense, he's just trying to keep everybody together and try to keep the peace.
Okay, so the normal... Okay, go ahead, Jenny.
I thought it was like a reverse discrimination against the civil rights movement of Sister Soldier, in the sense where he was kind of downplaying the fact that we will not let the fear overcome us here, black men.
I think that he kind of just hopped on a very circumstantial, moment that would be a good thing for his campaign. I don't know if he actually feels that way, but...
Keep in mind that he's seen as trying to win moderate voters here. And Stephanie might be right, but he's often seen as trying to divide people here.
Did Jesse Jackson know he was going to say that in his speech?
No, that's part of the story, that he hijacks Jackson on that. And Jackson is pissed off and would express his anger after this. He felt like he'd been done in wrong by Clinton by this. But that was, from Clinton's perspective, he wanted that response. He wanted the press to report that Jackson was mad at him, to create this kind of tension. Yeah, go ahead.
During this time, like when he's talking about Duke, was this still when he was a representative in Louisiana, or was that before or after he was the head of the Klan?
So the question's about David Duke, who's running during this period and having real mainstream electoral success and almost wins a Senate seat in Louisiana, I think. But Duke, so he's making this analogy, right, that racism, this is kind of Jenny's point, racism can cross both sides, because that's not what Sister Souljah had said, right? She said only white people can be racist because they have power. He's playing off of that line. Yeah, go ahead.
I found it interesting that he talked expressly about the comments made by Souljah, and similar to other politicians, he makes little notice of things like riots, inferior economic position, and other forms of discrimination.
So what's left out, right?
Yeah, so he's basically sweeping everything else under the rug.
Interesting. There's a comment in the back.
I think that he was definitely trying to win like the majority of votes by not going too extreme and being all for African Americans, but also still like trying to, like, we're not against the hate, but at the same time be trying to bring both groups together, like she was saying. So it was definitely trying to get like a flat playing field of everybody. It's just like, oh, we're all Americans, we have to not let them win, but same time addressing the issue, but not addressing too much to seem like he's against like African Americans.
Right, it's not coupled, and this is important because we keep seeing this, right? And this point's important here. It's not coupled with, yeah, Sister Souljah's wrong, but we have to address these issues of poverty. It suggests that racism, right, is a matter of behavior and speech, right, to a certain extent, right? What does Clinton say? Clinton says, no, it's not that I've been an advantage of kind of privilege, whatever that is. It's I made a mistake going to the wrong country club. I mean, right? And it's not tied. I mean, I think it's important to see how he sort of plays this issue.
I think it's total political opportunism. I think he's taking a play from the Atwater playbook and playing on the fears of America. Like you said, they were afraid of gangster rap. They were afraid of her. So I think that that's him kind of doing that. And I think today, if you asked him about reverse racism, if that was a possibility, I don't think his answer would be the same.
Go ahead, you guys.
So I'd say that he does a real masterful job of delicately balancing the issues and appealing to all different parties across the nation, which is what he's known for. That's sort of his signature. But I would have to credit his election victory more so to his charisma and his charm, and also a lot of people forget that Ross Perot did help him out in many ways in that election, because he took nearly 20% of the vote, and that helped bring down the incumbent George Bush.
Though the attack on NAFTA, right, is an attack on Democrats. Bush does, I mean, I think generally most people who analyze the election think that Perot took more from more from Clinton than he did from Bush. And so, again, I like that we're moving towards interpretation, right? Some people have really put the Sister Souljah moment at the kind of center of the election. Emphasizing kind of individualism is another way to think about the election. All right, let's just look at the kind of map for a second. And again, this is another. If Clinton wins Tuesday, this is another news commentator. He will owe a lot to Sister Souljah. The most important moment, this is sort of what Jake is arguing against, in the 1992 presidential race, probably came in early summer when Clinton criticized Jackson's Rainbow Coalition for giving a forum to a young black rap artist who had spoken favorably of blacks killing whites instead of one another. Right? So at the time, at least, this analysis is made. And again, the key thing to think about, you're hearing this, you're moving, right? You're thinking and saying, do I buy this analysis? Does this make sense? What kind of evidence supports it? Jake already challenged it in certain ways, right? By saying, no, I'm going to as a campaigner, and I'm going to emphasize Perot. This is an interpretation of the election worth thinking about that puts race at the center of thinking about American politics. So let's look at that. And again, it's a kind of argument. Let's look at the map. What's Clinton done here? Because the Electoral College matters, right? You only have to win a polarity in the state to get all the electoral votes. So, yeah.
You took back the Reagan Democrats.
So what states are you pointing to?
Ohio, Michigan, like the Rust Belt.
Yep. Go ahead, Elias.
He won California and the West Coast.
So he wins California, right? That's the appeal to kind of a new kind of liberalism based on kind of more identity politics, right? Not trade union based in some ways. What else do we see here?
He gets part of the South back.
Yeah, he wins the Upper South, Georgia, and Louisiana.
Majority of the East Coast.
Right, he wins the majority of the East Coast in part by pulling in these kind of Reagan Democrats and traditional liberals. And in reality, what Reagan, right, so some of this you can see the flipping of the 88 map here. And the flipping of winning, kind of, he won more white votes than Dukakis did. Couple key things. Despite the Sister Soldier moment, he wins a tremendous majority of the African American vote. Despite his support for NAFTA, he wins the organized labor vote. Because of Roe, his support for choice, he begins to turn the majority of the white women's vote in favor of the Democrats. Now, this points to an important dynamic in American politics, one that we have to continue sort of for African Americans, right, is the Democratic Party fool's gold. That in a two-party system, right, where are African Americans going to go? And part of the reason why he can do the Sister Soldier moment, if you take the kind of analysis that he's like hijacking, the kind of trying to distance himself for the black vote, he knows they have no place to go. And this idea of getting taken for granted politically is going to become an important part, right? Maybe politically disillusioning, going to set some of the table for Barack Obama. Same with organized labor. Where are they going to go? You can see this dilemma within the Republican Party now, right? The kind of Tea Party is sort of unhappy with moderates within the party, and the kind of middle of the party, where are they going to go? Right? Two-party systems create kind of sometimes not great choices. Clinton is thinking about that, right? And this debate over the kind of important presence of African Americans in the party and what the party is going to do for them is a debate internally that's really important, that the Sister Soldier moment exposes in a certain way, right? But Clinton's able to make the map work. Jake's point's really important. You can see Perot takes about 20%. Again, most people think he took 60% of his 20% away from Republicans. In a couple of close states, this was going to really matter, as we'll see. Now, let's think about, again, some arguments to consider, right? Just kind of going back, right? Again, I want to make an argument that the importance of Clinton's election is the long-term triumph of Reaganism. That Clinton's DLC argument is, we want sort of sensible government, right? I'm not going to be a tax and spend liberal. I'm going to pursue trade deals. I'm going to kind of lessen taxes on kind of the business class. These are an acceptance in some ways of mainstream Republican policies that distrust the government as a kind of key player. His attack on welfare as we know it begins to see the government as building a safety net is not a legitimate activity. His playing, if you will, the race card, dividing Americans, understanding the anxiety that still exists about kind of truly what it means to kind of pursue civil rights. I think Clinton recognized this in a way that Reagan had, in some ways Nixon had, in trying to appeal to the South and states' rights. And so that in many ways, right, again, I want to argue that Clinton's election is the triumph of a set of ideas that continue to dominate American politics. And the absence is important here. Because nowhere in this discussion is dealing with the persistent inequalities that are developing in the United States during this period. I mean, again, Los Angeles burns. And it's not the fundamental political issue of the day. As if that part of South Central isn't similar to North Philadelphia, isn't similar to parts of New York at the time, isn't similar to Chicago at the time. The absence of that discussion, to me, is profound in its silence, right? And Clinton participates in that kind of absence. Yeah, Les.
I think it's also like the triumph of moving away from a city and into the suburban and the campaigning, because overwhelmingly the cities didn't vote as much as out in the countryside and didn't have as much of an effect, but the cities were also the place where the economic disparity was the greatest. So you had the most economic inequality within the cities, but they were also the ones who were turning out the least in the polls and, weren't being the focus of campaigns.
That's a good argument. I mean, this is actually the moment that America becomes a suburban nation, majority suburban nation. Now, it's tipping back a little bit, but, right, and the politics of the middle class are associated with that. So, again, we'll make this argument. Now, a couple just strange twists, I would say. I'll do three strange twists, and we'll end of kind of Clinton in American politics. Clinton nominates as his vice president Al Gore, also a white Southerner. Generally, this is not what you do in politics, right? You try and balance a ticket. And some people have this theory. And again, it's a theory. This is not provable. But we'll throw this out there. And this is one of the campaign buttons during the period. So you can't even imagine this now. Using the Confederate flag to sort of push the Democratic Party because it has two Southerners on the ticket. And one of the arguments is that Southerners, right, are reassured by Southerners on the ticket. But Northerners are as well. In a kind of compact of whiteness, that Northerners believe that Southerners will hold the line on race, will not allow for kind of African Americans to take over the Democratic Party, and that there's this kind of implicit faith, a wink, wink, nod, nod, that Southerners will take care of it. And that Clinton's sort of very accent, right, and very Southernness is a kind of, even though this is not entirely Clinton's own politics, assures people that there will not be too much power. People who have this fear of African Americans within the party. So that's one kind of interesting kind of wrinkle. The second is, as many of you know, that Clinton would be, this is going to be a rocky ride over 8 years. And Clinton's infidelities would come back up again. Clinton's the Whitewater investigation over land deals in Arkansas, which, if you can figure that out, more power to you. But one of the arguments I would make is that the fierce anti-Clintonism from the Republican Party is that Republicans don't like Bill Clinton because he actually is better at some things that they like than they are. It's Bill Clinton that ends welfare as we know it as president and goes to what he calls workfare. It's Bill Clinton that actually reduces the deficit. Now, he's got some good kind of luck economically. It's Clinton that gets the trade deals in. And I have this theory that, in a sense, the fierce anti-Clintonism has less to do with Monica Lewinsky, less to deal with trade deals, than Clinton's very triumph on the politics that Republicans cared about the most. He stole their thunder in some ways. And the last sort of strange twist of the Clinton years, and this is a kind of interesting place to end. Toni Morrison would famously call Bill Clinton the first black president. And if you read this quote, what Morrison's saying is, and she's responding in some ways to the kind of persistent attacks on Clinton, that Clinton's own poverty, that Clinton's own kind of tough background, that those in power refused to let him climb. That those in power refused to let him that they would dog him. In the same way that Morrison felt like African Americans in public life would be dogged. And that Clinton and in his empathy and in his compassion in the face of this, embodies what she thought was a kind of ethos that people learned in struggle and poverty. And so declares him, interestingly enough, the first black president. And Clinton would go on. I mean, it's an interesting career from the Sister Soldier moment to hold a kind of revered place within some of the political class within the African American community, a capital that he would sort of blow when Hillary ran against Obama in South Carolina. But, right, that Clinton's kind of ability to adapt and change is really one of the kind of stories of the Sister Soldier moment. This kind of gets to Jake's point. This is an artful politician. And in his artfulness, right, we can see some of ourselves. His artfulness is in giving back to us what we are, some of our best and worst sides. Because that's often what politics is. And I think that Clinton understood that medium. Not necessarily raising us up. He sort of left us where we're at. All right. Thursday, I just want to let you know, this article is kind of long. We're going to read about the prison industrial complex. So we're going to kind of follow up on this riff of crime, of justice, and how America responds to it. And also play off the theme, a really important one, of something that's across party lines. That the triumph of the kind of carceral state that we have, kind of like the politics we saw today, is something that crosses party lines. And in some ways, that's why it's important. Thanks for your patience today. All right, I'll see you Thursday.